Okay, welcome everyone to our today's shortcut on one of the most debated topics, maybe in macro, how to reduce public debt, or do we have to reduce it? And if we do so, then how should we do it? And so the question is, do austerity programs actually fulfill their purpose? You could say maybe their only one and only purpose of reducing government debt. So we will discuss this question today. And because what seems to be a clear-cut issue for some, maybe including also our finance minister, Mr. Lindner, is anything but clear, according to at least to April's World Economic Outlook by the IMF. This report, especially chapter 3 on public debt, has also attracted a lot of attention at this year's spring meeting of the IMF and the World Bank. And for this report, the economists at the IMF evaluated a large number of consolidation attempts around the world, and the results were anything but clear. For examples, just to quote, the authors state that on average, fiscal consolidations have negligible effects on debt ratios, mainly due to negative growth effects. But then the question is, if consolidations on average do not reduce debt ratios, do we need other or new ways to deal with the situation? Or how can and should countries reduce public debt? And we are very happy that we have Adrian Peralta Alva here with us today. Welcome, who is one of the lead authors of this chapter. And he will present the main insights, and then we will discuss this. So just a short introduction also of the other speakers. So Adrian Peralta Alva is the Deputy Chief Division Chief, at the Research Department of the IMF. And prior to joining the IMF in 2012, Mr. Peralta was Professor of Economics at the University of Miami and Senior Economist in the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. Then we also have here with us today, and I want to welcome Philippa Siegel-Glöckner and Achim Truger, who have accepted to join the discussion and will give some comments on the presentation. Philippa Siegel-Glöckner has, after some years at the German Finance Ministry, founded the think tank Dezernat Zukunft with the goal to rethink economic and fiscal policy, in particular, making it more sustainable. I would say more in an ecological than a generational sense, but yeah, we can discuss it also later. Then we also are happy that we have Achim Truger here with us, who is since 2019 a member of the German Council of Economic Experts, where he is inter alia responsible for fiscal policy. And he's also professor of socioeconomics at the University of Duisburg-Essen. Okay, before I hand over to Adrian, one final remark. Mr. Peralta will not answer any country or Europe-specific questions, but will focus more on general points in this chapter. Okay, with this, I hand over to you, Adrian.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the interest in our chapter and our work. It's a privilege to be here, and we'll be very happy to engage in productive discussions with all of you. And indeed, the chapter is about how to tackle soaring public debt. The list of authors is long, so I will skip in the interest of time. And I presume you are seeing the presentation, correct? Perfect. So the motivation of the chapter, as I think you all know very well, for example, if you look at the black solid line in this chart, this is the average world debt to GDP ratio. And what you notice is that it has been going up. Of course, it jumped up during COVID-19, in part because of the fiscal response of governments, in part because of the GDP itself declining. The chapter is always talking about debt as a ratio to GDP, so keep that in mind. Then it went down, this ratio went down substantially as the economy recovered and inflation kicked in. But what is interesting is that at least up to our latest WEO forecast, it is expected to go back up. And something interesting is that it reached 100% of GDP in 2020, and is expected to basically go back up then. Of course, this is the world average, and there is a lot of heterogeneity. For instance, in blue, you have the United States. In red, you have China, where the debt has only been going up over time. So given debt is high, and I should clarify, we don't say whether countries should reduce it, but rather our question is if countries are interested in reducing it, how to do it durably. That's an important part. So we're not interested in things that go down and back up, but how to do it in a sustainable way. So to tackle that general question, we approach it from 3 different perspectives. First, we look at the past. So when countries managed to reduce the debt to GDP, how they did it. Then we look at different approaches. And I say approaches because one is a policy, while the other is more of a complication, which is restructuring. And I say complication because it's not a policy, it's not something that can be unilaterally decided. It requires agreement with the creditors, otherwise it's called default. And that's a whole different animal. And finally, what are the implications in terms of policy for today? Key takeaways in case time runs out. First, that primary surplus is an important driver. So when we look historically, how have countries managed to reduce debt? Consolidation has played an important role, especially in advanced economies. Growth and inflation are also important in emerging economies, especially. So what is the main punchline in terms of policy actions? Fiscal consolidation, and here, as the introduction was pointing out, we have an important qualifier: when adequately tailored, can reduce the ratios, and we'll discuss those in detail. The impact of restructuring is sizable and long-lasting, and is especially effective when you combine it with other things, including fiscal consolidation. The main lesson for today is that to reduce debt to GDP in a sustainable way, in a long-lasting way, it really takes it all. It's not only fiscal consolidation, but you have to protect growth, you have to have robust institutions, and all options may have to be on the table from the outset, especially for countries under debt distress. Restructuring may have to be considered from the beginning. Now, let's look then immediately into how has it happened. Here you have to be very careful. This is what people call a standard debt decomposition. I should point out, this is only focusing squarely on episodes that reduce debt to GDP. So it's looking at periods over which different groups of economies were managing to reduce debt to GDP. That's the only episodes we're looking in this particular graph. Such episodes, we notice, last about 5 to 7 years, depending on the country, etc. And what you have basically is the black dot, for example. Here it tells you that under such episodes, yearly, the countries that successfully managed to reduce debt to GDP were doing it at a pace of about 3 percentage points of GDP per year in advanced economies. Those are the black dots. Then you have, it's called a decomposition because the bars add up. So all of those bars that you see there end up adding up to the black dot. So here is one of the first messages I was telling you. What you see, for instance, in advanced economies is that red is noticeable. Red plays a big important role pushing down, and that is the primary balance. So fiscal consolidation in the past has been an important driver of debt to GDP at about 3% per year. Other factors matter as well, so don't lose track of that. Blue is there, blues are there, and that includes GDP growth and inflation. As you can see, blue is larger in low-income countries or in emerging economies, and that's why in my first bullet we were saying inflation and growth also play a role in those economies. Now, I mentioned this is not causality, so this is just saying when debt to GDP was going down, it happens that primary balance was being consolidated. It happens that GDP was pushing down, but there is no causality you can infer from here. So the rest of the chapter tries to touch at causality a bit more. Before touching into causality, we go into the simplest possible statistic you can look at, which is just descriptive statistics. So this is a chart I like a lot because it summarizes what then comes out of complicated econometrics. So what is here is we look now at year-by-year periods when countries were consolidating, so primary balance was improving. And simultaneously, we look what was happening to debt to GDP at that time. And then we say, okay, what is the probability or the frequency that you observe a period of consolidation happening at the same time that debt to GDP is falling? And what you find is that the probability is about 50%. So that means that you are as likely to see debt going up as debt going down, debt to GDP, please remember always, when you are consolidating than when you are not. So this is a first punchline. This is, of course, again, no causality. And we spent a lot of time, and in the chapter for those technically inclined, you can see we use different econometrics, sophisticated tools like the narrative approach, which is very fashionable, BAR, no matter what you do, the same result that emerges in this simple characterization also emerges, which is something that David was already preempting. On average, and that's an important, very important word, fiscal consolidation does not have any statistical effect on debt to GDP. From a perspective of a policy institution or a policy discussion, however, that's interesting but not useful, because we want to understand then, okay, when does it work and when does it not work, so that we can customize policy advice. So for that, we go into a slightly more sophisticated tool, which is SBAR identified with sign restrictions. This only matters for those technically oriented, and I'm happy to discuss the technicalities. But basically, the idea here is to say debt to GDP in this simple framework, we're going to think is driven by a number of possible factors. One is GDP moves, and that will, of course, move debt to GDP. Those are the first two. But then we want to split, and this is the tricky part. We want to split in cases where you consolidate and debt to GDP ends up going down, or you consolidate and debt to GDP ends going up, and see what we learn from that separation or characterization. And that's what we go in here. So this is perhaps one of the main results of the chapter. So let me guide you through it with a bit of care. We don't have much time, so I cannot go in full detail, but at least a little bit. So what is here? You have two, what they call impulse responses, but you can think of how the data behaves under different circumstances. Circumstances are the blue and the red. So blue is the case. So what happens in the data when consolidation actually manages to reduce debt? And you can see here, so what is exogenous in this chart? Consolidation. For expositional purposes, the consolidation we talk about here is a 1 percentage point of GDP. So in both situations, you see a 1 percentage point of GDP consolidation. That's imposed, that's exogenous in the exercise. The rest is how does a 1 percentage point of GDP consolidation look like in the data. So the path you see here is kind of the average path that you observe in economies, advanced economies. And with this tool, we managed to separate the ones that succeed. So the blue says when you manage to succeed, debt to GDP goes down by about 2 percentage points of GDP. While when you fail, let's say, debt to GDP actually goes up by 2 percentage points of GDP. And there are differences, important differences across some variables. Let me point to one in the interest of time that is very particular because it's very noticeable and easy to see. So when you consolidate and the impact of GDP, negative impact of GDP is large. So you see, for example, this red value. So for a 1 percentage point consolidation, you end up reducing the GDP by more than 1 percentage point. So this is what some people refer to as the fiscal multiplier. In periods or in situations where the multiplier is large, chances are that you may end up actually failing, so that debt to GDP will go up, in contrast to situations where the multiplier is not so large. Thankfully, there is a large literature studying when it happens that the multiplier is large or small. So we don't debate that literature. There is a long literature there. And a couple of conditions I can point out to you in the interest of time again is when you are in the middle of an economic expansion, for example, you are likely to have a small multiplier. So when times are good, it's a very good time to reduce debt to GDP. The other situation is depends on the composition of how you do the consolidation. Are you reducing spending that is not very productive, or are you reducing spending that is actually very good for the economy? That will matter, of course. So we go a little bit into that in this other graph. There is a literature, but we also do a bit of our own contribution. And we see what are the conditions under which it's a good idea to do a consolidation. And that's what we have here. So the baseline probability, as we mentioned, that you consolidate, and if you don't look at any other conditions, that you end up reducing debt is about 50%, as discussed before. But that probability changes dramatically under certain conditions. For instance, if your economy, as I was mentioning before, is recovering, if the output gap is not large, you have the probability that you consolidate and debt goes down, debt to GDP, increases by 6 percentage points. So suddenly it's not 50, but 57. Similarly, if your economy and the world economy are doing well, then the probability, this more or less add up because of how we do the econometric analysis. So then you're talking about 75% probability or something like that. If in addition you are in a situation of low world volatility, probability keeps going up. So this is the bottom line of the other bullet that I say, when adequately tailored and under the right conditions. The final one I want to point out is this one, because maybe it's a bit puzzling. So when debt to GDP, public debt, remember we're always talking about the debt of the government. When the debt of the government is very high, the probability that reducing it a little bit helps a lot is higher, and that may be puzzling at first, but it's actually not so puzzling. When the debt of the government is very high, that means that the government is taking away a lot of the available financial resources of the economy. So the private sector is hungry for resources, but the government is taking them all or a lot of them. So when you, in those conditions, when you reduce or you consolidate, you shorten the role of the government, some very productive projects of the private sector may enter into the game, and then the effect of the GDP is not as bad, and therefore you manage to reduce with higher probability. So that's that part on the debt consolidation. I know the interest here is mostly on this, but let me touch very briefly on debt restructuring. Just very briefly again, since debt restructuring is not as familiar to everybody, a few facts. When does it happen in the data? And what you see, when and how? What you see is most of the times when restructuring happens, when it happens, there are two versions of restructuring. One is that the creditor says, okay, you have a debt of 100 with me, I forgive part of it. Now you only owe me 80 because I know you're having a hard time. That's face value reduction. That's not the most common way in which it happens. The other way in which it happens is the creditor says, no, you still owe me 100, but I know you are having a difficult time, so take more time. I'll give you a chance. That's a cash flow relief. That's the most frequent way in which you observe these restructurings. It also happens mostly preemptive. What that means is before missing payments. And it also mostly happens with international organizations, so the Paris Club. Now, straight to the point, restructuring is really a last resource, and you see it in the behavior of economies. So zero is the period when a country enters the negotiations of debt restructuring. And what you see is typically the probability that a country enters a restructuring is preceded by higher and higher probabilities of being consolidating. So countries are trying to reduce debt via fiscal consolidation. And when that fails, only then they try this last resort approach. Let me not go into here, but go into the main result, and then I stop with restructuring. So conditional on restructuring happening, and this is a big sentence, many countries undergo restructuring and fail. But when you do it, it does have a substantial effect. So that's what's here. What is the pure effect? And by pure, I mean we have done a lot of econometrics to try to extract the pure effect of restructuring. What you see, even the blue, in restructuring is that it has a substantial reduction effect on debt to GDP and that it lasts. But what is important is that you have to mix it with consolidation to make it work. So please do not read the chapter as do you do fiscal consolidation or do you restructure? No, you need to do both to have an important effect. To conclude, let me just touch on one thing. Here, working at the IMF, we have the benefit of having interactions with teams. We have, each country has a team that knows a lot about the country. Countries, the IMF visits country by country and learns a lot about the actual details, how it's done in real life. So we talked to the teams and we came up with a few case studies, and I just want to show you some of them here. So we talked to countries that succeeded and countries that failed in reducing debt to GDP, especially dealing with restructuring. And here we have some of them. And what you see, for example, let me pick the most radical ones. All of these countries went through restructuring. And for instance, in Seychelles, this is again a debt decomposition, like I showed you early in my presentation. And what you see, this is not a mistake, by the way. The first time I saw it, you may be tempted to say, no, really? So this country, and this is total, of course, this is not per year. Seychelles, during the period of their restructuring, managed to reduce their debt to GDP by more than 100 percentage points. Of course, they were coming from very high levels. But my point in the policy lessons, if you remember, I hope, is that it takes an all-out approach. What you see here in Seychelles is that all bars are pushing down. So it's not that they restructure and that's why they managed to reduce debt. In part, yes, but you also see that GDP was pushing down, that they were consolidating. Of course, the only element that cannot push down is the nominal interest rate because it's nominal. So by construction, that will always push up. But everything was in their favor in some sense. To the contrary, the countries that failed, these countries, some of them actually went under more than one round of restructuring. And in spite of that and the painful process of restructuring, debt to GDP, actually nothing happened to it. And what you see there is that, well, they were also not doing many things. For example, the red, fiscal consolidation, does not show almost at all. So it really takes an all-out approach to reduce debt to GDP in a sustainable way. In the interest of time, I think probably I should leave just the policy conclusions there. And go straight into the conclusions, into the discussion, because I think I'm out of time.
Perfect. Thanks a lot.
Should I stop sharing, David, or should I leave them there?
I don't know, do Philippa or Achim, you don't have slides, right? But maybe you can just unshare and then maybe for the discussion, if you want to raise some points, then.
Perfect. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, so I would directly hand over to Philippa maybe first, and then to Achim for a few minutes of first round of comments, and then we will, continue the discussion.
Yeah, and thank you for that presentation and for actually digging into that topic, because we're discussing the reform of the European fiscal rules at the moment, and everybody has agreed that, or most people seem to agree that we should be reducing debt to GDP ratios. I honestly have my doubts about the ratio, but anyway, this seems to be agreed. But then we all agree, and then no one really discusses how we do it. And as you said, it's very clear when you have debt and you have GDP, and if you want to reduce that ratio, you need to look at both variables. And for some reason, we don't. We look at debt only, and we somehow seem to think that growth is unaffected, even though if we look at past episodes in Europe, we have pretty tangible evidence, and now you did it in a much more rigorous way, that consolidation actually it can affect GDP growth pretty badly. So I think just carefully looking at the topic is already a great progress, and I wish that in the debate on European fiscal rules, we would discuss this more and think a little bit harder about how we're actually getting to that goal and what kind of rules can facilitate that. I'll make a couple of comments and already embed some questions to you, if that's all right. But I'm also happy to repeat them later on. So yeah, what really stood out for me is how important growth is in a way. It's much easier to consolidate. I think there's also quite some evidence in the past that, especially if economies are undergoing structural change, and that's often associated with these periods, we're definitely going to have it in the coming years because of decarbonization. That all works a lot better with growth, and then you can consolidate. But what do you really do with that, when you have fiscal frameworks? And I mean, it's not like current fiscal rules have any provision anywhere. I mean, maybe you're aware of a set of rules that say, you can wait for growth to come. That dependency is not there. There's no kind of state switch in the rules. So yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on what do we do with this, growth and a strong international environment help a lot. Then I actually had a question on what your thoughts are, I mean, on basically monetary fiscal interaction and the whole regime behind that, because when we look at Europe and how easy or hard it is to reduce debt ratios, I think that interaction plays a huge role, and what kind of regime we have on that governs interest rates and risk premia in particular. If you look at Italy in recent years, they couldn't even have created as much growth as the financing costs put on top. It's a very difficult discussion, I think, whether you need risk premium or not in a currency area, or to what extent. It's not that easy that you can just say, let's just get rid of them. But I think the monetary regime matters, financing costs matter. So, I mean, to me, it looked like also probably to get a large enough data set, you can't differentiate by monetary regime, but I would be interested in your thoughts on that. Yeah, one question I had on your presentation, you said, if I understood correctly, that high debt stocks make it more likely, high debt to GDP ratios, that you're going to succeed, because basically you have a large state sector capturing maybe or leading to inefficient production, not leaving resources for the private sector. But I mean, I would understand if that measure was deficit, but stock measure from the past, like how do your past debts that you have racked up, how do they interact with, or how are they a good proxy for how much space you take in the economy? So I was a bit curious about that one. And then I mean, going to your second part of the presentation, I was really curious because I mean, it seemed like, okay, restructuring by itself can't do the job, but in combination can do the job. But to what extent is access to finance and cost of finance in particular, I mean, after the restructuring, a problem? Because that's, I guess, what everybody is terribly scared of. I worked in Liberia for a bit, and Liberia is a permanent restructuring case, but we were always extremely scared of what that would do to our financing cost, and kind of saw it as impossible to then reduce that afterwards because of that. And then finally, I mean, in your country examples, I mean, you showed how basically every factor has to play in favor. And one that seemed quite big and you didn't really talk about, and again goes to the monetary regime, is inflation. So it seemed like, yes, you need to save on the primary balance, but growth helps, and a bit of inflation probably also helps. And then what do you do with that? Basically going into the same monetary regime question as on broader consolidation. So yeah, thank you very much. Incredibly interesting, and I think very, very timely.
Okay, thanks. I would first maybe hand over to Achim, and then you can answer the questions later. Okay.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. Thanks for the presentation. I think the presentation was very good and convincing, and I really liked the analysis. Particularly, I think you were extremely careful in trying to sort things out, and I like very much that you checked different methodologies, different techniques, like the narrative approach. And basically the results were the same, were concerning the probabilities of success of consolidation. So that was very, very convincing. I think the results are plausible. That's basically what well, we some of us had to learn in the austerity period in Europe and in maybe in other bad situations, but that's very consistent with the evidence. I also like very much that you try to connect the results with the multiplier debate. That's very very convincing. So thank you for all of that. Maybe just 2 questions, and then I turn to what I think could be some economic policy conclusions. The first question will be, I mean, I'm not in the pro-austerity camp, but just as a devil's advocate, couldn't it be possible that you have some ambitious fiscal shock, so you try to consolidate hard, and then you get the negative growth and the debt to GDP level goes up? What about the long-term consequences? Where would we be able to see such a more medium to long-term success, which is what many people are aiming at? So could we see it in the data somewhere, or maybe can we really rule out that this works? Because in your in the graphs that you showed in the figures, it looked like well, if it's successful, then it's successful in the first year. If it's unsuccessful, then it fails in the first year. So, but could there be could the results maybe switch over time? That's the first question. The second question is what could also be interesting is what about the composition of consolidation? Maybe do you have any evidence? I mean, when we talk about the multiplier debate, then obviously we may debate whether the expenditure side multiplier is larger than the revenue side one. What about public investment, where usually all the estimates say that's the largest multiplier? So can we learn anything, or do you have any idea about the effects of the structure of consolidation packages? So that's the second question. Then just briefly some comment on the economic policy conclusions. I think, well, as I said, it's very convincing and intuitive the results. And I think the conclusions for fiscal policy and the consolidation ahead for Europe or the EU is quite obvious. And I see your results in line with many other results, and also I think basically they confirm the EU Commission's strategy for reforming fiscal rules, because this is a very careful approach, which tries not to overdo consolidation, to look at the different country-specific characteristics, and then really try to find an expenditure path which will in the end bring down the debt to GDP level. And I think that basically this approach, I feel, is confirmed by your findings. And on the contrary, then all those who would like to see ambitious consolidation and would like to see maybe specific targets, annual targets for the debt to GDP level or whatever, I don't think that this is compatible with your findings. And so my hope, and that's the last sentence, my hope would be that all of those fiscal hawks that think that you can really prescribe specific annual deficit or debt targets, that they finally realize that this is going to fail, and that you need a different, more intelligent approach. And I think that's basically the approach that the EU Commission has has by now found. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Achim. So I think very nice comments and interesting questions. Maybe just to say two things, to connect two things. So I think two things you already mentioned, Adrian, that one thing which is very crucial is timing, and then also, of course, the quality of consolidation. And this, I just want to pick up something Achim said on how the consolidation should be composed. And I just want to throw in, before handing directly over to you, a quote from an article from The Economist, who basically do the same assessment as you do in the report, but reach a little bit different conclusion. They write that politicians could dial down their promises to pensioners or ensure that their role in the green transition is not larger than it needs to be. But there's little public appetite for austerity, and spending is bound to rise as populations age. More defense spending and green investment are essential, and all this makes tax rises inevitable. So they basically say it has to be the revenue side, as I read the chapter, but you can explain, you would tend maybe more to the expenditure side. So I just wanted to throw this in and then directly hand over to you.
Thank you very much, David, Filipa, Achim. Very good comments and questions. Of course, they are so good that I'm not going to solve them all. So it's more of a building a discussion. So let me try to touch on some of them. Both of you talked about fiscal rules, institutions, their importance. Of course, we are very aware of the discussions in Europe. The chapter does not deal with Europe specifically, but I could advertise internally. The IMF, of course, has some position papers on what is touches on Europe. I have a paper myself with Pierre-Olivier Gorinches that also touches on that, so I invite you to look into that, where I guess one of the parts that I think Achim mentioned is, well, also Filipa, that there tends to be a bit less of a focus on specific debt to GDP targets, because it's not so clear that debt to GDP, even the European papers, fewer of them nowadays relative to the past, talk about specific path and what debt level you should have today. I know the 60% remains in Europe as an important figure, but nobody, I think, says that should be today or in 2 years. So people are moving a bit more towards a risk-based approach to how interest rates are reacting, market information, and trying to keep sustainability. So that's a general point coming not from the WIO. So now let me go to the WIO part. On institutions and fiscal rules, I didn't have time, but the chapter does touch on it, and they are very important because one of the things we noticed, and this is low income, but also advanced economies, and that was surprising to me, is that sometimes it happens that you consolidate nominally, let's say, because you observe a country that reports it's doing fiscal consolidation, but then there are these below the line operations that unexpectedly and relative to the budget, so there some expenditures emerge unexpectedly from the perspective of the budget that undo the efforts that the country is trying to do. Very common is transfers to state-owned enterprises or some unexpected debts, devaluations. That all of that can kick against you, and having good institutions, clear budgets that prevent that is important. Filipa mentioned a lot the monetary side of things. I think it's a good point to touch on another publication. So similar to the WIO, there is the Fiscal Monitor, and the chapter of this spring is only about the role of monetary policy from the perspective of inflation and debt to GDP. So that is a good place to look. In fact, in our own analysis, one thing that sort of prominently shows is that in periods where debt to GDP is going down, especially in the successful episodes, so you have two perspectives. One is this debt decomposition, and you do see that in periods when debt to GDP is going down, inflation is also pushing down. This in part relates to the fiscal monitor findings, where they say unexpected inflation indeed reduces debt to GDP in a very important way. So there is a fact, but what we have to be careful is that good policy? And probably no, because you don't want to erode your institutions, right? So it happens, yes, but it's not something that you may want necessarily to exploit. You see how we're fighting now with inflation. So yes, the high inflation has reduced. In fact, the debt to GDP reduction we observed post-COVID is one of the largest ever observed, and is to a very good extent driven by inflation. Are we happy about the high inflation? No, I don't think so. So there is a distinction between what happens and whether it's the best way to do it. So that relates a bit to the monetary fiscal interactions, but there is more to it as well. So part is unexpected, but the part of expected. So in our own VAR analysis, you see, perhaps this is the closest to your some of your points, Filipa, that indeed it seems to be the case that when the country is consolidating, in some sense, if the monetary part accommodates a little bit, that doesn't hurt. So that emerges in our own analysis. You asked me about the high debt and stock versus flow. So there's always two sides of the equality. So in the model, basically, or in the economy, you can think of two different accounting principles in some sense, right? And my point to try to reconcile is, in some sense, the overall stock of assets that people hold. So when you add up all savings, all available resources to the financial system from a stock perspective, have to equal, in a stock perspective as well, all of the liabilities of the economy, right? And that includes, of course, the private sector and the government. So there is a one-to-one relation between flows and stocks. So you are right, indeed, but in some sense, we are also right from that perspective. And when the stock of the debt of the government is very high, that's when you have this crowding out effect. So when crowding out is very large, the benefit of reducing the stock a little bit opens the possibility of the private sector improving. You also touched on restructuring and the cost of finance, and definitely. So in the chapter, we were very careful. I was perhaps less careful in my presentation of saying restructuring is a last resort. One of the main reasons is exactly what you said, that yes, it comes together with typically with an increase or even exclusion from international financial markets. But that's why I also said, this is not a should I do restructuring or should I do consolidation. If you are interested in reducing debt in a smooth way, let's say, if you can afford to do it in a smooth way, and that was on my policy conclusions, you should do it smoothly. But sometimes you're faced with turmoil, right? So sometimes you are really, perhaps unexpectedly or suddenly under debt distress. At that time, you may have no other choice, unfortunately, right? So it's not that we're saying it is a very good and costless strategy to do restructuring. No, it is costly. But sometimes, in some sense, is the only option once you're already in debt distress. So that's an important message on the chapter, that if you are under debt distress and the only option is going to be to do restructure, it's better to do it right away. Like, one important finding is timing matters. It's better not to be ambiguous, thinking maybe yes, maybe no. If you need to do it, since it is time consuming and costly, you better do it right away. And then let me see on Filipa if there is any other. On the case studies, yes, so the monetary interactions that you mentioned, Filipa, emerge quite pronouncedly. You see that inflation is a big chunk in there. Thank you, Akim, for the methodologies. Yes, the message is difficult, but I should say in full clarity with my own institution, this issue that consolidation hurts is old, and the IMF has pointed it. In fact, in 2010, there is a WIO chapter called Will It Hurt? I think the title is brilliant. And it talks about fiscal consolidation, and it does say that the impact on GDP is large. They don't discuss debt to GDP, but the chapter is about, will it hurt if you do fiscal consolidation? And I think the answer to the will it hurt is yes. so in full transparency. On the timing, Akim, you pointed out something that I also did not emphasize because of time. It is true that in the data, so the dynamic features that you see in the VAR responses, in the VAR responses, are revealing what on average happens in the data. And you pointed out they are front-loaded, so everything kind of happens at the beginning. So basically, what our analysis shows is that the successful consolidation, how it looks, and I pointed out that in the figures I was showing is the first differences. So if I translated that in levels, it will be countries that succeed, consolidate right away, and hold it. And that's what succeeds. Apparently, it's not my opinion, but what emerges in the data. No, you're right. You posted a different question, which is, my question was durably. For us, the definition of durably, if you remember in my charts, we were showing something like 5 to 7 years horizon. So that's our durably in our perspective. You were saying, can you go longer? We haven't tried. We haven't tried, period. But it's also true that when I look at data, on average, the episodes, so we were looking in the first part of the data compositions. If you look carefully in the chapter, we discussed, we did a bit of work in trying to isolate or look at how episodes, so periods or sustained periods of time over which countries are reducing debt, how do they look? And it turns out to be the case that their length is on average also 5 to 7 years. So maybe we could do in the VAR longer horizons, but from the other perspective, it looks that it just doesn't happen. It's very difficult to sustain. I mean, of course it happens. There are longer episodes in the distribution, right? I'm telling you averages, and certainly there are longer episodes, but on average, that's their duration. So that's part of the thing. You also asked me on the composition of the consolidation, and you pointed out to the literature. And we also did it, and we find, especially in advanced economies, similar to the literature, that reducing spending is better than reducing taxes. That is very tricky, and you pointed that out. You know, when we look at reducing spending, we look at the average observed reduction in spending, but you are very careful, you were careful, and we didn't go in more details, but you're absolutely right that there is a literature saying, well, yeah, but there is spending and spending, right? If you're reducing wasteful spending, for sure, that's going to be not as damaging. If you're reducing very productive investment, in the long run, I'm less sure, and our chapter didn't go in those details that are very important. So point very well taken, and we make a bit of a note of that. I think that's what I have to say. But please, if I miss something important, I'm very happy to go back.
Okay, I would just give Felipe and Achim the chance to answer if you want. Otherwise, there are also some questions in the audience I would otherwise ask, but please first feel free to react to that.
Achim, you want to go first, or? Okay. I mean, less a reaction to your comments as, you know, I mean, we are in Europe, we are talking about these rules. I understand that you should probably stay away from it, but we can. And just thinking about everything you said doesn't make me particularly confident that we're on a good path. I mean, I know that we are going into a more differentiated regime, and I think there's a separate conversation about whether that's good or not, but just in macro terms. I mean, if you do DSAs and, you know, try and implement what the Commission is suggesting now, a lot of countries will have to run big primary surpluses over a long period of time. At the same time, you know, we don't have loose monetary policy. Growth projections are very, very low. We are going into massive transformation. So maybe I'm too pessimistic, but I have a hard time seeing how this ends up well. And then, I mean, also, you know, talking about the crowding out point, I think financial crowding out is a really difficult one. One has to talk about macroprudential, money supply, all sorts of things. But real economy at the moment in Europe, we probably don't have so much of a crowding out situation, but more a complementary one, because I mean, in the end, you need public money for energy systems, for subsidies, all these kind of things to, you know, get the economy to growth, or to at least carry on with the same capacity in a net zero scenario. I think we massively underestimate how hard that will be to just keep our economies going at the rate they are, with that emissions constraint that is very significant. And one thing I miss in the proposal by the EU Commission, where they try and project everything and they pretend the world is the same as in the past, we have a massive additional constraint on emissions, and that's not in the macro projections. So yeah, that's just leaving me a bit with a big question mark on how this is going to end very well. And then, I mean, I know that, you know, this discussion has been on debt to GDP, but I always have to mention it, especially since in Europe we're so focused on debt to GDP and very much equating with fiscal sustainability. I think there should be a big question mark whether that's the right goal right now. Debt to GDP really talks about the past. We need to transform our economies. We need to make sure tax revenues in the future are coming. And debt stocks really don't tell you very much about that. So actually, I mean, this would be one question. I don't know whether you have time to talk about that, but if at the fund you are thinking about what good measures are to capture, you know, fiscal sustainability in times of transition. We're thinking about a measure of comparing debt to basically net zero asset stock, so all the asset stock that can still be productive in a zero carbon economy, because that's in the end what's going to give you your cash flows in the future. But maybe I'll leave it at that because we have very little time.
Well, thanks. I'm fine. I mean, Adrian, you went through all the lists and addressed everything, so I'm fine, and we can, I think, turn to the general discussion. Thanks.
Okay. Then I would just read maybe a question. Andrew Watt from the IMK asked a question on timing. So are the good and bad GDP growth periods assessed ex post, or how are they assessed? Of course, governments have to decide whether to embark on consolidation based on forecasts of future growth, which might prove wrong. So how can you address this uncertainty, basically, and have you also addressed or taken this into account in your analysis?
Should I
yes, I think you can maybe just answer.
Okay. No, Philippa, thank you very much. And yes, you know, the case of Europe is not treated directly in the WIO, or is not treated at all directly in the WIO, in fact. So I just say maybe there is a lot of discussion in the IMF, and there are some positions. And indeed, I think part of the suggestion is to do a more more risk-based approach rather than only debt to GDP centered. One important characteristic that I think touches on some of your concerns that come from our analysis is that it's very important to have counter-cyclical fiscal policy. So yes, it's okay, you know, if you are under a difficult situation, that if the government, if it has buffers, it can use them to try to smooth things out. But what you cannot do is to also continue spending in good times, because then you never reduce debt to GDP. Of course, a challenge that you definitely point out, and it is a complicated question, is the issue of we need to do the green transition, and having a space for that is crucial. And there are discussions on how to design fiscal rules to accommodate for that exceed my capacity. But you pointed out certainly to the points. In the analysis of the WIO, one of the other, so countercyclical fiscal policy, I think, is crucial. Given that levels are so high, my personal impression is if the economy is doing well, in some sense, you cannot afford not to reduce debt if you are worried about having high debt to GDP. The recent question, David, that you read is more, not, I mean, I guess future matters as well, yes, but if the economy is doing well, and typically that you notice, and in the data things are very as economists say, serially correlated. If the economy is doing very, very well now, it's very difficult that tomorrow, literally, you enter a huge recession. There are always a bit of signals. So if you're in periods where you know the things are heating up and going well, and you only see things going better, those are cases where you simply cannot afford not to reduce debt per our analysis. Because the part that we have been focusing a lot in today's discussion is the fiscal consolidation impact on debt to GDP. But one of the interesting results that happens that you can find in the chapter is we ask the following question. So debt to GDP moves, yes. There are two reasons, yes. One is fluctuations in GDP itself. The other is fiscal consolidation. We focus on the fiscal consolidation. Well, it turns out growth is much more important. When you look at the numbers in the chapter, the explanatory power of growth in explaining the behavior of the debt to GDP is twice as strong as consolidation. So if the focus should be growth in some sense, it's very difficult to do it only through consolidation. And that goes back perhaps to the green transition, Filipa, although sometimes it's tricky, no? So we know how some governments are, and it's very easy to say, oh, this is green, but maybe it's not, maybe it's an excuse. So there are difficulties there as well.
Maybe something that also popped up as a question from the audience. And also maybe relates to something that Filipa said. So what should we actually be considering when talking about debt and debt sustainability? So Filipa looked at it from one side. So maybe we should especially look also take into account green assets when thinking about putting decarbonization as one, maybe the most important thing we have to do. And then the question from the audience is also to take into account then implicit pension debt obligations. That comes more from the other side. And also touches upon the second, maybe next to decarbonization, the demographic change challenge we have ahead of us. So what maybe you want, or also Filipa and Achim, you're free, of course, to answer. So maybe debt to GDP is not the best measure. What should we use? I mean, Filipa already said or proposed one thing. So how do you also at the IMF maybe think about these things, looking beyond the simple measure?
Yes, no, thank you very much. And, you know, unfortunately, of these very interesting questions, the chapter does not touch, because your question is sustainability, and we literally do not talk about sustainability. What the chapter is about is for countries that want to reduce debt to GDP, what to do, period. So it's far less ambitious than your very interesting questions. But to all of your points, however, there are plenty of publications in the IMF that talk about, you know, looking into a more consolidated present value that, for example, takes into account the aging characteristics. And so there's a lot of work being done, but unfortunately not this chapter and not the presentation I'm giving. So excellent questions. I invite you to explore. If you Google search IMF, demographics, sustainability, a lot of work is being done. The only comment I can make out of recent papers that are there is that there is definitely a shift towards looking at more than just debt to GDP and more of a risk-based approach, looking into, for example, rolling over risks and, you know, what the market is telling you about, you know, your financing possibilities. We still look at debt to GDP because I don't think you can ignore it. A household never ignores its debt level. But the government has also a budget constraint.
Thanks. We are nearly approaching the end of the session. So I think I just want to thank you all again for participating. Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, Filipa. Thanks, Achim. And also thank you to the audience for this discussion. And yes, I just want to wish you a nice day or nice evening, depending on where you are. And yes. Goodbye.
Thank you very much again. It was a pleasure, and happy I remain open in case people have further follow-ups. Much appreciated. We appreciate your interest, and thank you.